Hello, everybody. Welcome to Informasia for September the 16th in our fourth year here. We are pleased today to have a longtime member, David Burleigh, give us a talk and about some of his research. He sent me a brief biography. He is a retired professor from Ferris University in Yokohama after teaching there for many years, and part-time teaching at Waseda at the School of International Liberal Studies. And he's published a number of textbooks, which I am impressed by for sure. Some small collections of collaborative translations, haiku and poetry, and academic study and essays here and there. So we will benefit from this tonight. All right, with that, David, can I turn the screen over to you?
Yes, can you see this?
Yes, it looks fine. Go right ahead.
I mean, you can see me on the side. I'm sorry about the blank space on the right.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
This is going to be, in this talk, I'm going to revisit my own arrival and early days in Japan, especially the first month. And I suppose, but it's not going to be all about me. It's about Bernard Leach and other things. Why do I move that up? Okay.
Okay.
Preamble. The story begins on the 30th of August, 1978. And Narita Airport has just opened. There'd been long battles, as everybody knows, between the farmers and the government and involving students and police and so on. Quite a few people were killed. I think it had just opened a few months before I arrived. And when I came through, I was flying in from, I had been living in London and I was going to come here and start teaching English in a language school in Shinjuku. And I came through into arrivals, and this Japanese man said to me in a slightly apprehensive voice, he said, "Are you David?" And I said, "Yes," because I was. And he had come to me to meet me, and the arrangement was I was going to stay with him for the first month. His name was on the list at the bottom, Tanahashi Takashi, who was a former teacher and had been a teacher and essayist and poet. And the reason he was coming to meet me because I had decided I wanted to come to Japan, and I'd got to know a few Japanese people in London. And through one of them, I was put in touch with him. And he wanted, the arrangement or the deal was that I was going to stay with him, and he wanted me to help him with deciphering bits of tape recorded interviews that he had, hours and hours of tape recorded interviews with Bernard Leach, which he had made while he was living in England. He'd lived there for a little bit over 4 years. And he got to know Leach, and then later he published a book about all this, and that was the purpose of that. So I stayed with him for about a month downtown. The arrival was fairly memorable. Everybody remembers their first arrival, but I had flown the cheapest way that I could possibly get a one-way ticket, which was an Egypt Air, and I left on London on Monday evening or late afternoon, and had a rather hairy night in Cairo, and then got on the plane again and went through Bahrain and Bangkok, Manila, Tokyo, and arrived in the boiling heat on the end of August on Wednesday afternoon, and he came to meet me. I was exhausted, of course, but I was young, and so it was quite exciting too. He had never met me before, and I must have probably sent him a picture. I can't remember, but I had been in touch with him, of course. And he came, then we took the train he lived in downtown Tokyo in Ojima, near Kameido, in a danchi, a public housing thing. That was his home. He had a 2DK there, and I was going to stay there. And we got the trains and then walked up. I had a large suitcase. We didn't have wheelies in those days, and dragged it about 15 or 20 minutes from the station in the heat. And then when we got to his apartment, he discovered he'd left his key at the airport. Oh, he had something which was a glasses case, and the key, I don't know whether it's in a little bag or something, but anyway. So we went upstairs, and he rang the doorbell of the woman who lived next door to him, and asked her if I could climb over the balcony, because he'd left the doors onto the balcony open because it was hot. So I went in and then climbed over. And the memorable part was he was living on the third floor here, second floor in Britain. And as I went out onto the balcony and then started, I was half asleep, started to clamber up over this division, he said to me, please be careful. If you fall, I think it is difficult to live. And so I clambered over down into the garbage on the other side, and then I opened the door and welcomed him to his own apartment. Now, he had a DK, it was a DK, and there was one tatami room. He slept at the back, and I slept facing the balcony. And there were some pots by Bernard Leach just next to where I was sleeping. And he'd put them on the floor underneath a sort of small cabinet which had long legs. And the idea being, which contained books or whatnots, bits and pieces, I can't remember what, but was the idea that if there was an earthquake, the cabinet would fall over, but the pots would be all right. He didn't put them on top of anything. It didn't seem to matter that the cabinet might fall on top of me, but anyway. And I remember the next morning too, I was very tired. He was a single man in his late 50s, and he had an adopted son who lived in the neighborhood, who came over later. It was the only time I met him, a bit like Donald Keene with his adopted son. This man was, I think he came over later to bring the key, a spare key. I never met him again after that. But I was hoping to sleep in, of course, because I was very tired after this 3 days on the plane. But in the morning, the glass door onto the balcony was open. I was woken up very early, about 6:30 or something, which for me is, I'm not an early riser, it's very early. And by this noise from outside, which was going, oh, hey, hey, ho, hey, ho. And I got up. I thought, what the hell is going on here? And I looked out, and of course, it was Radio Taiso, the morning exercise program on the radio. And these people were doing it to a loudspeaker out in the square. Welcome to Japan, And that was my initial arrival. Anyway, he took me out. I went up to Shinjuku to start work in this school, and I came back to him in the evening, and then we went through these tapes of Bernard Leach. He had already done a fair amount of redaction, but there were bits that he couldn't understand, the words. And I have to say that some of it I wasn't quite clear myself, because he was 90 years old and he was drinking a cup of tea and eating a biscuit, and sometimes he would mutter bits in Japanese as well. And it wasn't always absolutely clear, but anyway, we got through all that. And then I moved up to a room in, Tanahashian was quite kind to me while I was there. And he didn't complain when I went up to Shinjuku and stayed out all night on occasion, for example, and that sort of thing. But he told me when I moved up to Shinjuku to rent a room myself that he thought he'd be finished the book in about 6 months. And he did eventually present me with a copy of it inscribed 12 years later. But the books are like that. And what I want to do today really is to talk about the book. And I've had a copy of it for 30 years and I've never read it. And I have now finally actually read it. And so what I'm going to do is to go through and give some account of what he says and what about his meetings and interviews with Bernard Leach and what comes out of that. It's very sort of written in a very poetic kind of way, but I won't swear that I understand every syllable of the book, but I've got the gist of it. The main players in the story are, of course, Leach's story are Leach himself, famous author of A Potter's Book, and Hamada Shoji, who was probably his closest friend, who was later declared a living national treasure, who was a potter. There were others, but they were the closest, these two. And the third one is Yanagi Soetsu, who was the theoretician of this movement. I'm not going to go into things about craft and art and what is what or any definitions. I'm just going to tell a story. I believe Timothy Harris is going to talk about that later, I think, but I'm not going into that. Although I did have an email actually last night from, just by the way, from Nain Woodrow, who's an Australian woman who lives in London and runs a pottery. I don't think she would be here probably today, but I sent her the information. And she told me that she trained as a potter in Kasama, and spoke Japanese. And she had met actually both Leach and Hamada in the 1970s. Anyway, Tanahashi, I'll go on with this a bit. There are lots of things about, there's a full biography of Bernard Leach now by this man, Emmanuel Cooper. I haven't read absolutely every word of it. It's pretty good. As you can see from the image of Leach himself there, I mean, he was very English and rather old-fashioned. His son described him as Edwardian. He's wearing a tie even when he's throwing a pot, you know, although he does have an apron on top. It's quite a good biography. And there's he wrote many books himself. This is one which has an iconic dish of his with a drawing of a pilgrim on it. His book, A Potter's Book, was a tremendous. This book was written after the war, when he came back to Japan for a visit in 1952 to 54, and it was first published in 1960. His diaries and so on about his of his travels. He was greatly feted in Japan. And very famous. This is another book which is relevant to the sort of story by Edmund Duval, who is a potter himself, who came to research Leach in Japan, I think, and studied Japanese for that purpose, and was somewhat disenchanted to understand that, to learn that Leach didn't speak Japanese, really. I'll be touching on that as I go through the book. It's not true that he didn't speak it at all. He says himself that he didn't read it. In his books, he says that. But he did understand some. So I think this is at the Nihon. He did his research at the Nihon Mingeikan in Komaba, which was started by Yanagi. But the book I'm going to talk about is this one, which is the one that Tanahashi wrote, which is called it's called St. Bernard. The title is Tamashi no Tsubo, which is well, I'll translate that later, maybe, and subtitle St. Bernard. St. Ives no Bernard Leach. And it was published by Shinkosha on the 10th of May 1992, and is based mainly on the author's visits to St. Ives and interviews he tape recorded, much of which I listened to myself. As I say, I've only just read it. It's quite nicely produced. And there's a picture of Leach there sniffing some lily of the valley taken by the author. And the flowers were brought by the author as well. No, sorry, before I go on to that, I'll go through the book first. Now, I'm just going to run through quickly and explain what the book is about. It's divided into 16 chapters, and the opening chapter is called A Fated Journey, Umme no Tabi. And he's traveling down, he's living in England, he's traveling down into Cornwall in a hired car. I'd forgotten actually that he could drive. I don't remember him driving. And he's taken by these mysterious names like Land's End, and he'd read about these places when he was growing up, and talks about associated writers, W.H. Hudson and George Gissing and Daphne du Maurier, of course. And then he comes to St. Ives, and he sees a big sign in the road that says Leach Pottery, which reminds him of having once seen Leach in the 1950s at an exhibition sale of his work at Mitsukoshi department store in downtown Tokyo. And he saw him in the distance as a tall man dressed in dark gray. He was very tweedy, and gazing into the distance and quietly absorbed. And then he remembers having heard a lecture on Japanese art and craft by Yanagi Soetsu when he himself was a student at Keio University during the war. He was born in 1920. Tanahashi, he told me to call him Tana. He was a shortish man. I haven't got a photograph of him. I may never have taken a photograph of him. One didn't photograph everything in those days, but he was a shortish man with a largish head and gray hair and a beard. And his hair was slightly long, the way you do, you make it if you're intellectual, and so on. And he was quite friendly and amenable. There's one person here, Osamu Note, who did meet him at the time. who was living in the area downtown in Tokyo. Anyway, he notes also that when he heard Yanagi lecture, he had a homespun look. This is part of the whole thing. And he puts the word in English in the text. He goes up to the Leach pottery, which he's seen, the building and the sign and the road, and it doesn't seem to have a gate. And he puts up at a local B&B. He takes a look inside, but he doesn't go and bang on the door. And then he goes back to Bournemouth, where he seemed to be staying at the time, through Hardy Country and so forth. And then he comes back again to St. Ives and stayed for a day or two and looked around. And he called at the Leach pottery and met a woman called, I think this is Mrs. Yates, who tells him that Leach, he buys a small dish and she tells him that Leach likes to meet visiting Japanese, which is an encouraging sign. But he declines. He holds back. And he's really interested in, at this time, in Alfred Wallace, who was a naive or primitive painter. He was a retired mariner who lived in this area also and took to painting after he retired and painted ships and was quite successful and admired. He's quite well known. And then he comes back, the author comes back again, and the second chapter is called Wallace's Grave, where he goes to visit the grave, which is on the outskirts of St. Ives, and Leach had designed some tiles for the grave of Alfred Wallace, and he looks at those, and then he calls again, and he's introduced at last when he goes to Bernard Leach, who is now almost blind. He's about 90, almost 90. And he has at first a slightly testy encounter with the potter's third wife, American woman called Janet. She was too. And she had an exhibition in Japan when they came over together in the 1950s. But her exhibition was in Osaka, his was in Tokyo. So they were separated. But Leach, when he had an exhibition and sale, it was tremendously successful. I mean, about 90% of the stuff was sold on the first day. And he was fated everywhere he went. He meets in this chapter, he meets Leach, who reminisces a bit about one of his friends at the time called Takamura Kotaro, who was a sculptor and poet. And he pulls out some letters, but they don't go into that much. He talks about East and West and Schiller and one of his rivals, William State Murray, who was a potter before him. But his sight is dim and he can't see much. His house assistant, really, Trudy, is there, and she's helping him to compile his memoirs, which were later published, called Beyond East and West. The third chapter is called Man of Mud and Water, and he talks about a BBC film about Wallace. He's still interested in Wallace and meets some local people. These are very short chapters. Another one, fourth chapter, is called Canary Colored Sails. He puts up at a hotel and goes to a gallery and learns about these ships in a bottle in a little gallery run by a Miss Bernard. There are lots of Bernards in this story, and becomes friendly with her, and there's a picture of it and so on. And then the fifth chapter, which is much longer, sees him arrive. He's down in St. Ives again, arrive at Leach's flat in the late afternoon, and he's shown upstairs by Kathy, there always seem to be lots of people around when Leach is there, his family and various staff in the shop and in the pottery and various people helping him. And he's taken upstairs to meet Leach, and he finds him sitting in a chair under a picture of the Chugu-ji Kannon in Nara, and has a first encounter with his secretary, Trudy Scott, whom he describes as a talkative woman with a husky voice. Warning sign straight right away. I met her later when she came to Tokyo. And she's helping him because he can't see. And this chapter is kind of significant one because it talks to Leach and presumably tape. He never mentions a tape recorder in the book, except once when he's playing a recording of a TV program or radio broadcast later. But it's obviously there with him at the time. And when Leach is talking, and he talks about politics, he talks about Blake and Yeats and haiku and friends and rivals and Japan and China and so on. it's a rather disjointed and wandering conversation. It ends with, and then the significant part of this chapter for me anyway, reading the book and knowing the author, was that he says how happy he feels when he stays to dinner with Leach. Leach goes downstairs, and because he's blind, he can't see very well, and he's helped into a chair, and it's all very informal in the kitchen, and they're eating quite simple food off plates, pottery presumably, from the pottery, and he suddenly feels he likes this, and the author likes this, and he feels happy and relaxed. So this is his first sort of warming to the situation. And he wasn't a very easygoing person, really, Tanahashi himself. So this is the beginning of his sort of warming to the situation. And at the end, he stays until late in the evening, and it ends with a sort of poetic bit, which may be imaginary, where he leaves after he goes outside, he thinks about the potter himself going up lonely in the darkness to his bedroom. And he then joins, he says, a group of young people going around the town dancing, and ends up with a ticket in his hand that has a date expired. And I wasn't quite clear whether this bit is imaginary or something that actually happened. The sixth chapter is Damp Autumn Rain, called Wandering. And he goes to the shop of Miss Bernard. She shows him the ship in a bottle, and he takes a picture of it and so on, and talks about Barbara Hepworth, who was the sculptor, who was a friend of Leach. She died in a fire, but she lived in this area too. And he describes the Grey Sea and alludes to Greek mythology and adds bits of poetry and so on. In the seventh chapter, Sailboat Painter, there's a Bernard Carter, who's some painter of oils locally. St. Ives became a magnet for artists later. It is a very beautiful place. I haven't been there, but I've seen pictures of it by the sea, with lots of little inlets and beaches and beautiful views. He talks a bit about this sort of primitive or naive painting and the English painter L.S. Lowry, and another man called Michael Cardew, who was a student of Leach's and worked at the pottery, and who suddenly says, he talks to him, and who suddenly says, I love Leach. The sixth chapter is called Lunch. The chapters where they have meals seem to be more substantial somehow. He's coming and going to London. This is his fifth trip, which is in 1977. He stayed in England for 4 years and 3 months. And when he's got these probing questions, Leach had traveled, of course, all over the world to do with poetry, and he asks him of the various places that he'd been to, which one he liked best, hoping for some insightful answer. But there isn't anything very clear forthcoming. And so he asks him this is a sort of carefully angled question. He asks him whether he prefers English or Japanese tea. And Leach answers, to which the answer, which is given in Japanese, is that he prefers English tea. And so this is, meant to indicate that Leach's the essential Leach in his heart and mind is English, I guess. But I think it's not a very interesting question myself. Anyway, they talk about the Taisho era and Shiga and the Shirakawa Society, which was the society started by this craft group led by Yanagi Soetsu. And then in the Taisho period, when Leach was born in Hong Kong, and then he lived in the early part of his life, his mother died in giving birth to him, and he was then brought to Japan and lived with his grandparents, who were missionaries in Kyoto. And so he says later, his earliest memories were of Japan as an infant. He talks about the Taisho period. He said that Japan isn't there anymore. He also strongly denies, he says he likes slipware because it is, he quote, born not made. And he strongly denies that his work is folk craft. Or that he is a disciple of Morris, although he did have some contact early in his life with some of Morris's disciples when he was a student. He studied art in London at the Slade School of Art, by the way. And then he says that since he's lost his outer sight, he can't see, his inner sight is clearer. And the author says, like Beethoven's music, deepening after he lost his hearing. And he says, oh, yes, exactly. Now, I just might mention, this is a textual matter, that the way that the book is printed is that what Leach says is translated into Japanese. And of course, the writer is writing in Japanese, but Leach's conversation, when he's speaking in English, is translated into English. And when he blurts out things in Japanese or says a few words in Japanese, that is put in katakana to indicate that it's different. And so it's quite clear. And there are some words in English as well. So there's no confusion, I think, about whether he is speaking in English or in Japanese himself. And it's quite clear that he does, he can speak Japanese to some extent. He talks about he talks about Mark Tobey, who was a painter, an abstract painter, and he was a Baha'i. Leach became a Baha'i at the end of his life, late in life, seeing this as a kind of meeting of East and West. And Mark Tobey was a Baha'i and led him into Baha'i. And also his Trudy Scott, the woman who was his helper, she was a Baha'i as well. So there are these connections with the Baha'i movement. He talks about how he misses the time when he lived. He said he enjoyed company of Japanese and painters, and he wanted true or real or dear friends. He goes on to say that when he visited Japan in the 1950s, he didn't have to pay when he went to inns or restaurants. He just gave them a drawing and everything was complimentary. He was greatly celebrated. And there are other reminiscences about Hamada and so on. His colleague of his whose work he didn't care for, Kawai Kanjiro, who was a contemporary in Kyoto. And then they talk about painting. He likes Rembrandt and Van Gogh to some extent, and Cézanne. And when he went to Scandinavia to look at pots and furniture and stuff there. Now, that's 8 chapters. There's 16 altogether. The 9th chapter is called Burning Tiger, Hono no Tora. And the book completely veers into another direction. In this case, it's exactly halfway through. And I was a bit baffled by this chapter. It begins, the title is Burning Tiger is an allusion to Blake, the poem by William Blake, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright in the Forest of the Night. And those Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright was printed in English on the journal of the Shirakawa Group magazine. So it has lots of resonance. But what happens is he goes to see Leach again on another visit. And as he's leaving, the author stands up and pressed a copy of A Potter's Book into his hand and urges him to read it. And then he goes back to his lodgings, his B&B, and Mrs. Rolfe, the landlady, and says that she and her husband are going out for the evening, and she gives him a key to let himself in when he comes back. And then he goes out to eat and goes down to the harbour and has fish and chip, fried cod, chips, green peas and carrots. Very English food, which he seems to like. And there are hardly any people around and so on. And then he looks around the harbour and describes it lyrically. And then he goes back to his B&B, his bed and breakfast, and he finds that the key doesn't work. They've given him the wrong key by mistake. So he waits there for 2 or 3 hours and they don't come back. And so he doesn't know what to do until it gets about 11 or 12 o'clock. And so he decides then he'll have to go and look for a hotel. And he tries 3 hotels. And then the 4th one that he comes to, some surly room boy shows him up to a room. And he goes to this room in the hotel, and he sees some people eating and drinking in the lobby in a bar area. But anyway, he goes to bed, snuggles down in the bed and falls asleep. And then he starts to dream. And that is what most of this chapter is about, this dream. And it's really quite strange. He's suddenly back in Tokyo. And it's the 8th of March, 1945. The B-29s are firebombing Tokyo. He had grown up in Koishikawa, and everything is burning, and it's including the area of his childhood. And he says his father's house is alight. And then he realizes, he thinks that the person who set fire to his father's house, it wasn't the B-29s, it was himself, the author. And then it goes into this bizarre dream sequence where he's walking with his two granddaughters, possibly the children of his adopted son, and in a forest, and a tiger suddenly appears and attacks him, and he's going to defend the children at the cost of his own life, and then the tiger pushes him to the ground with its paws on his chest, and he thought he'd somehow encountered it before, and then beyond this he can see fire vision. He sees his father and his mother and has memories of them, that his father didn't like him and he wasn't sure that his mother did either, and so on. And then at the end, he hears an orchestra playing Mahler, and he seems to come back then to recollections of being bullied or disliked at school. And then the whole thing switches to his lodgings in North London, in Tufnell Park. I looked it up, Monterey Road. And then it goes back again to Tokyo in flames. And this nightmare vision, he quotes William Blake, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright, as Leach had also done previously. And then after breakfast, he returns to the B&B. And it's all very strange. It goes on for pages and pages. It's one of the longer chapters in the book, and it's right in the middle. And he's about to go, and he goes back to Mrs. Rolfe said she'd been at a party at the same hotel. She was probably one of the people sitting in the lobby when he went past up to the room, and she offers to refund him the money, but he refuses. Then he later goes to see Leach again, and somebody asks him to show Leach a bowl and so on. And he asks about Hamada and discusses the Potter's book and talks about other people, and Blake and Shirakaba and so on. And then when he talks about all these Korean pottery and Amida Nyorai in Nara and Roda and Mayol, the sculptors, and he asks Leach to write or draw something on blank sheets of paper, and wonders about people, about English people and stones and infinity and belief. And then Leach is so moved, recollecting his own good fortune, he asks, "Why me?" And then Leach goes on to talk about Blake and Shakespeare. He prefers Blake, who he says is Shimpitsugi, which is mystical, but I think Blake is more visionary than mystical. And then he talks about other things, but he talks about the benefit, how good fortune has been to him. And then Leach himself goes into some visionary memories of, he says there are 3 times in his life when he had a vision. Once when he had flu when he was 14, and again when he was a student, and lastly when he was walking with his wife. It must have been his first wife, who was actually his cousin, near Ginza, near the fish markets in Tokyo, in Ginza. And he suddenly flew up. These are his words. He said he suddenly flew up into the air 20 feet or more, as if he could go anywhere unstoppably, and felt alone in eternity, and the sense of God before this vision ended, which he says then concludes by saying, the vision vanished and he came back to the street level, walking along with his wife. And then he says very quietly, "God exists." This is what Leach says. There's a bit more about Okinawa and Korea and so on. He repeats, Leach repeats this infamous sign in Shanghai, the famous sign about no dogs are Chinese, but that is actually inaccurate and has been debunked now. If you look it up on the internet, there never was a sign that said exactly that. Check it out on the internet. There's a Wikipedia entry on it. Historians have looked into it. And so then he leaves. And the next chapter is very short. He's looking to meet the author of a book about Alfred Wallace, but he never meets him. But he has correspondence with him about Japanese and Chinese culture and Leach and Jung and so on. And the 11th chapter, Harbour, is also quite short. But this is the one where he goes on the way to Leach's home. He buys some flowers, scented flowers, freesia and lily of the valley, and he presents them, and Leach sniffs them. That's on the cover of the book, and enjoys that. Blind people, of course, can still enjoy smell. And then he gets a coach the next morning back to London. And then Leach talks again about, in the next chapter, which is called Gold Star, that's a kind of joke, about his first memories of Japan. There was a biography in 1934 compiled by somebody who was a psychologist or psychiatrist, I think, called Shikiba Ryuzaburo, which is mainly recollections of Leach by other people and a collection of Leach's own articles. And that's referred to in the other main biography, but I don't know whether that book is in all in English or in mixture of English and Japanese or what. I've never seen it. He talks about getting the Companion of Honor and meeting the Queen and so on, and about Mark Tobey again and Omar Khayyam and so forth. He says that these are his religious beliefs. Death is just moving to another room. That life is, we go on immortal become immortal. The next chapter 13 is called First Love, and it's June. The author goes to the Leach pottery again and buys an avocado to give Leach. And he's brought his tape recorder to replay a TV program, but that's not terribly interesting. When Leach became 90, there was a program about him on the radio. And he says that Leach says what is most important to him is slipware in natural shades, and that pots be made for use rather than ornament. But this is fairly well known. This was his philosophy and outlook. And it's not so much exchange as absorb. What he got in Japan was not so much exchange with other potters as following as absorbing the spirit of the craft. That was what he most cared about. And he was also a draftsman. He could draw as well as make pots, and so on. Then Yanagi, Hamada actually died on Leach's birthday in 1978, on the 5th of January. And he talks a little bit about making pots also as being a search for the mother. Maybe his own mother had died when he was born. I don't know whether other potters feel like that about pottery or not. And speaking about all faiths as being really one, which is what Baha'i is about, joining East and West, and Rakuen, paradise. And this is what, the author says he will have to return to Japan soon, and he will be searching for Rakuen. And there's a young Japanese woman who's married to an American who turns up there. Then they have another meal, and this young Japanese woman and her husband come, and Leach says things in Japanese, and he notes that the young Japanese woman and the author himself get what he's saying, and the other people don't. So he must have been able to communicate. And then Leach remembers about the cries of the bread sellers in early Taisho, and selling Russian bread, and later bread made with genmai. And that makes the author nostalgic about his own youth in Tokyo, people selling things in the street. And he writes a couple of things on shikishi, those square cards, that people write poems or slogans on or whatever. The writing, they're reproduced in the book, but the writing is almost illegible. But Leach writes, which is a poetic line, "Then I saw Venus on the wave." But the other one, he says, "How I hate over-accentuated individualism." This is his outlook and philosophy. And one interesting little thing too, Mako, the young Japanese woman, brings in some matcha, green tea, and they drink that. And Leach tries to remember meeting a tea master in Nagoya, who he visited. This is just a little point about where, if you read sources in different sources, and especially like this in different languages, you can sometimes get contradictions or different facts. Because he says in the English biography, there's a lyrically written episode where Leach goes to visit this elderly tea master and is shown a pot by Kenzan the something or other. And Leach immediately identifies it as being by this famous potter centuries ago, and it's written about lyrically. And the firing of the design of the pot is supposed to be shigure. It's given in the English biography as shigure, which is translated as approaching storm, but that's not what it means. It means just autumn rainfall. But it turns out from the book in Japanese that this is all nonsense. That actually the pot that Leach was taken in, but so was the tea master, and that the pot was actually not by, it was something that had been foisted onto the tea master. And he gives a reference to an article in a crafts journal in 1983 explaining all this, that it had later been shown that this pot was actually not what it was put out as. That's just a little detail on the way. 15th chapter, parting. He goes to see Leach for the last time, rings the bell, and is met like a cold blast by Trude, the secretary, and then sees him again, and he's very quiet, really. And then he talks about French pots and rubbishes, Picasso's pots, and so on. And then the author, he departs, and he he eventually leaves and comes back to Japan. And then the 6th chapter, last chapter, is called Vision of Paradise, Rakuen no Gensho. He leaves in June. That was the same year that I arrived, I think. And he's relieved to be back in his Danchi apartment, but he finds himself unused to the weather, of course. Then he's working at his table where I sat with him in the Danchi, listening to these tapes, and he suddenly sees like a kind of holograph, an image of Leach, he imagines sitting on a chair just nearby. And it's late in the evening, and he says, "Good night, Mr. Leach." And then he goes to bed, and he feels very much that Leach is watching over him. And then after that, he sends Leach a gift of some yokan. And then comes the news of Hamada's death and Leach's death. Leach was still alive, actually, at the time that I was listening to these tapes. He died the next year, I think. And then, as a kind of epilogue, Trude, after Leach has died, Trude comes to Tokyo and stays with, is met by the author and stays with him downtown and so on. She wants to see, and this is a little bit problematic. I did meet her. She was a rather, not really horsey, but one of these rather strident English ladies. You know, she spoke quite loudly. When I met her, she said, "Oh, I was his eyes," she said, very insistently. Because he was blind, she had to guide him about, and her luggage goes astray, and it's been sent to Warsaw instead of Moscow and doesn't arrive. And she goes up to the Bahai Center in Shinjuku and makes a fuss. And then there's somebody else said it's almost as if she's expecting Lech Walesa, the president of Poland, to get it sorted out. I don't know. But anyway, and then there's some incident on a train where she says something which causes consternation. I didn't quite understand what had happened there. But anyway, she did stay with him, and then she went back. And then after the book, the book closes with a couple of waka from the Manyoshu, which I say something. They're full of sadness and seem to be expressing the personal feelings. I have that. I mean, they're about being lost in the world, adrift at sea, sadness and longing and so forth, not knowing what the future holds. Both of them are like that. So that's where it ends. And now after that, the follow on from that, if I must just go on for a few more minutes, is that Tanahashi-san himself gave me a copy of the book when it came out in 1992. He asked me, there is an English subtitle, and he asked me about the subtitle, which he was going to call it. It's called Tamashi no Tsubo, and he was going to call it, can I find the book? He was going to call it, I don't know if I can enlarge that a bit. He was going to call it Pot of Soul. I met him one day in Ochanomizu to talk about this, and he came, I think it was on that occasion, he came dressed, wearing a yellow tracksuit and looking really for all the world like a rather large pixie. This diminutive Japanese man with a beard. But anyway, we talked about this for a while, and then he settled on, I'd forgotten this actually, he called it Vase of the Soul. I suggested calling it Vessel of the Soul, but I inadvertently said it sounds, like the Bible. It's a much more resonant title. Not that it really matters, it's only a decoration, but Vessel of the Soul, because it's ambiguous and is more resonant, I think. But when I mentioned the Bible, he got in a snit and said, no, I don't want anything out of the Bible, and so on. And so he ended up with vase. I did go down to stay with him once. He had a besso, a little, which he calls his Yamagoya, down in Izu, mountain cottage, and I stayed with him there briefly once, but it wasn't really, he had a nice garden. He was very interested in flowers, which I'll come to in a minute. That's the end of the story. But there was an exhibition of, in 2001, Heisei 13, I think that's 2001, at the museum in Shirakawa about Leach and Hamada Shoji, and that's the information about that. And towards the end, it went on for a few months, and towards the end of that, he gave a talk on his book. And I received an invitation to this and went along to listen. Actually, I went along to the museum one day after the book. It must have been around this time, and there was a table in the lobby with a pile of copies of the book. And I was looking at it and thinking, oh, well, there it is. It's around. People are buying it. And when I lifted, there was somebody standing on the other side of the table from me. And when I lifted my eyes to look, it was Tanikawa Shuntaro, the poet. But one of those moments you don't know what quite to do, whether to say hi or just pretend you haven't seen them. But anyway, Tanahashi was invited to give a talk. And that's his invitation to the talk. And I went along to it. He sent me a sorry, that's the sorry, I should be going back to the smaller size. That's his invitation to the talk. It was limited to 100 people, but the room was full. And he talked. I didn't think it was a terribly good talk as far as I could follow it. He seemed to be just wittering. He talked a lot about the painter Wallace at the beginning and seemed to be wandering all over the place. And at one point in the talk, he'd seen me come in and he mentioned me. And and then he looked around and said he couldn't see me. So he said, oh, mo kaita kana. I said, oh, maybe he's already gone home. And I didn't, of course, realize that what you're supposed to do in that situation is to stand up and identify yourself, which I didn't do. But I talked to him afterwards. In the lobby. He was wearing a fisherman's sweater, all this sort of homespun look on that occasion. And I could see that he was pleased that I had gone. So I was glad that I had. Now, the follow-on to that is he went on, I kept in touch with him. I have a box full of his letters. And the next year, a couple of years after that, he sent me a copy of a journal to the museum, this is the journal, the Minge, and he had a column in this, which is called Bernard's Dream. And this is 2003. So he went on writing this stuff. And in the column, it seems to be, it's number 10. It's very small print and I haven't read it. It's very difficult to read. But it seems to be ongoing, and he describes himself in a continuing column. So he went on with this, contributing, writing things, and he gives himself at the end as, in brackets, as after his name as poet Shijin. But the other important strand in his life is about flowers, which is a separate story. And this one leads me back to Ireland, which is where I came from. Just before his book came out, Tanahashi, that's a picture of him there, by the way, on the left. Just before his book came out, he sent me a copy of an article that he had written in English for The Garden, which is the journal of the Royal Horticultural Society in England. And it mostly consists of letters that he had exchanged between me and him and a Mr. Guy Wilson, who was, his dates are given there, who was a famous horticulturalist in Northern Ireland who specialized in daffodils and had indeed a worldwide reputation. He was the leading, perhaps the leading authority on daffodils and making new varieties. And these are the letters. And he records that he'd first written to this man asking for a catalogue in 1939, before the war, but he never got one. And then they got in touch again after the war. He had told me about this. He ordered daffodils from this man. It describes all this in the article, and quotes the letters they exchanged. And the man was known for his generosity and would often send additional bulbs, and then he grew them here and explained how the best way to grow them and send his catalogues and so on. And so he was ordering bulbs from Northern Ireland, daffodils, or narcissi, many different varieties, in the 1950s up until the death of this man. It's almost like a kind of love story, the exchanges between these two gentlemen. And he at one point then ordered from Hamada, commissioned a vase, which he sent to Guy Wilson, the horticulturalist, as a gift. And he acknowledges that and says that some of the daffodils will look very nice in it. And I was kind of curious about that. When I had well, I'll come to that in a minute. He does say actually in 1992-3, when he wrote the article, that that by then the vase was probably worth about £9,000 in sterling. Did they know what they had? But I'll come to that in a minute. But anyway, a memorial garden for Guy Wilson was opened in 1972 at the University of Ulster in Coleraine, and at that time had 165 different varieties of daffodils, and no doubt has many more today. And their contributions are made by collectors, other horticulturalists and specialists. And this university is my alma mater. And I had no idea of this connection when I met Tanahashi at first. And the last thing that I received from him, I kept in touch with him, was a copy of a column that he had written about daffodils for a gardening magazine called Enge Sekai, an illustrated thing. And that's the column that he'd written. And it gives his name there. And he talks about Guy Wilson in that. And I had sent him, I used to, if I came across anything about Leach or connected with all this, I would usually tell him about it or I can send him copies of flyers. I mean, there were memorial stamps about potters issued in Britain and with pictures of pots by Leach and 3 other potters. And these are illustrated in Tanahashi's book. And I'm pretty sure I sent him those stamps. This article is illustrated with a couple of postcards from the university of the daffodil garden down at the bottom on the left. And these are postcards that I sent to him that he's used to illustrate the article. He called me, that's 2006. So he was still writing things then. And I have as I say, a bunch of his letters. Now, he called me once after that, but I never saw him again. And the last letter that I sent to him was returned. Now, a little bit before that, he had called me. The last time must have been, I think this article is 2006. It must have been somewhere between that and 2010 when I was away for a year on sabbatical. It was definitely before that. So it was probably 2008 or 2007, 2008, something like that. And it was in this apartment that I'm living in at the moment. I remember he called suddenly one afternoon and he spoke in English. And he said, he was thinking of going to England again and feeling nostalgic about that. And I said to him, you know, I don't think you should go again. I mean, he was well into his 80s by then. I mean, I said, England has changed. I don't think you should go. And then the call came to an end. And then about 15 minutes later, the phone rang and it was him again. And the second time he spoke to me in Japanese. And we had a sort of similar conversation, but he'd obviously completely forgotten that he'd only just called me. So I realized then that he was getting confused. And so the last letter that I sent to him, which I have around somewhere, was returned not known at this address. And that must have been, I think I sent him some flyers about, I have the letter, it was sent back and I never opened it. It just came back, but I think what's inside is a couple of flyers about some exhibition to do with Leach. So I suppose he must now be dead. That's the end of the story. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Could everybody please unmute if they would like to?
And I can unshare, I suppose.
Right. Yes, definitely.
How do I do that? Stop share, maybe that.
There you go. That looks great. All right. Well, amazingly, we only have one question, so there'll quickly just be a basic discussion here. But it's from Charles DeWolf, and he asks, when did Leach start to lose his sight? Was he completely blind?
I think he was completely blind at the end, but I'm not quite sure. Sorry, I can't remember. I think in his 90s, quite late.
Okay.
Or no, sorry, no, in his 80s, but coming in his mid 80s. I think he could see kind of a little bit of light, but he couldn't distinguish things. But I'm not quite sure about that. No, I should look in the biography. Sorry about that. I'll check it out later and send you the answer from the biography.
All right. Well, with that, I'd just like to open it up to general discussion. I did in the near the end of the chat put in a message from Yamanouchi Sensei, the older gentleman who usually concludes our discussion. He and his wife are being taken to dinner tonight by his family out of respect for the aged. Remember, it's that day here in Japan. But he said very complimentary things about David and his talk, and he very much apologizes for missing tonight. Okay,
generous in his comments.
He is. He's a wonderful person. All right, so I leave it open. Who would like to say something? Questions or observations? We have several Potters in the room here.
I don't know if Osama noted if he did actually meet him. I don't know if you have any comment.
Actually, I don't remember. I've been there. I know. I
met him only briefly, I think.
Yeah. And I have no recollection clearly. I know the place. Yeah, I remember the place, but he was a little bit aloof. I mean, artists and thinkers, and I couldn't make much out of him. And but listening to your story, I kind of thought about the difference between art in general, like paintings and statues, and also the crafts. Arts and crafts has a complex relationship. Like in Britain, when they criticized Indian art. They didn't accept artistic objects in India, but they loved Indian crafts, actually, like weavings and so on.
Well, that's
So,
the stuff that you studied, I know, yeah.
so they're separated things. But a chap came up from Britain, and he said, they are not separated, they're together. And they changed the British view of Indian art at the beginning of the 20th century. And that really caused a new art movement. It's connected with the nationalism of art in India. Yeah, it was a very important change, actually. The British changed the attitude to Indian art, and crafts played a very important role, because British are very much aware of the importance of crafts back in Britain. And so it was easier for them to appreciate Indian pots and weavings and so on and so on. William Morris was very much influenced by Indian, weavings and paintings. Decorative paintings and so on and so on. So in that sense, yeah, maybe it's a different genre in art, but those objects, useful objects, practical objects are also interesting in the sense that they can trigger a new awareness and discoveries, across the culture, Well, at least that's what happened in India, actually. I was thinking about that when I was listening to your story, David. Yeah, not much about him, but
Timothy Harris is going to talk about all that sort of thing a bit later, I think, in another context.
Well, I don't know. I'm not specialist, but I sort of followed for the culture history of objects in India. So, but I kind of felt that those small objects, and they're close to the life of people, and they are also the objects of beauty, and artistic appreciation, and also a part of life, day-to-day life. And so it could be deep and complicated. It's not just a painting or
part of the discussion actually early in Leach's career. One of his predecessors, a potter, used to make sort of very decorative pots and give them titles, and they were really for display. Museum, whereas his take on it all was that the thing should be used, that they were sold to be, and there's a kind of missionary and moral aspect to that. His book on the Potter's book was known as the Potter's Bible. His grandparents were missionaries, of course, but there's a slight. I think that was the thing that Edmund Duval didn't like about his approach, apart from the question of whether he could speak Japanese or not.
Maybe, but as I said, Brits are really into artistic movements already in the middle of 19th century.
I know they were, yeah.
Because they're exposed to India and Turkey and all the countries, British and East and West, was kind of merged in a sort of through that kind of dimension of life, culture aspect, and I was just thinking about why pots and crafts. Yeah.
Well, I suppose because pottery was big in Japan, and of course you have Yanagi. He is the theoretician of all this. The unknown craftsman and so forth. The classic Sung pots and Korean pots and so on. Nobody knew who made them, so it wasn't the author. It wasn't the potter, the artist expressing himself. It was supposed to make something that was fine in its own way, I guess.
Okay, we have two hands up, so I'll go first with Mary and Hada in the Save Jingu Gayan.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I was a little late. I have only just been sent the link by a friend. And I was wondering if people here know about Marty Gross and the films that many films of and about Bernard Leach that he has been, how can I say, renovating. He's also been creating some films about Mingi potters in Japan with modern people, how can I say, commentating on what you can see in the films because they're rather old films. When Bernard Leach died, his widow asked Marty, who is a potter himself and a filmmaker in Canada. He's actually an old family friend, and he was asked because he is in the film field to take care of the films. And I saw him here earlier this year. He was presenting some of these films. Some of them very short. Some of them are about Bernard Leach, and they're also about other areas in Japan. So I just wondered if people know, because I know that Marty will be coming in December. And I just offhand don't have the details, but he has a group called Something to Do with Minge. And his films are fascinating. This summer, there was a really interesting Minge exhibition at the William Morris Museum in London. Some of his films were on show there. And I'd just like to give you the word because he'll certainly be coming in December. And if anybody's interested, I'll try to send the word to whoever would like to know.
So,
Can I send it to you, Patricia?
yeah, Marian, could you in the chat, could you type in the name of this person and maybe
Oh,
the
okay,
film?
I'll do it. What I'll do is I'll go and look at some of the material he has sent me before, and I'll share it in the chat. Okay?
Okay,
Yeah, I promise you they're very, very interesting films, so I'd like to share the information.
yeah, please do. And can you give me your email address as well?
Sure, I'll put that in. Okay, that's
all
me.
right.
That's
Hey,
all.
that's really great. Okay, now we still have two people, but next is Ursula.
Could I just say, I think I have heard of this a little bit, but there is quite a lot. If you just look on the internet, I mean, there are short films about Bernard Leach. You can see how he talked and what he looked like, and on YouTube, there are quite a lot. If you just search his name, there's plenty.
Yeah, it's just more. I'll go and find the link, but truly, if you look on YouTube just for Marty Gross, I think you'll find something there.
Okay, well, just give us his name. That would be really helpful. All right.
Okay.
All right. So Ursula's been patiently waiting, so please take it away.
Well, I want to thank Anne Jenkins for sending me the link in the first place. I'm delighted to be with all you people. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool, long-term Minge International Art School art teacher.
Whoa.
And was blessed one time in the early 80s with a woman called Sugiura, whose husband was a pianist. And she'd been in Edinburgh and had got to know Janet Leach. And when the Leaches visited Tokyo, they went to her husband's concert, and we were deliberately sat next to them so that during the intermission, I was able to talk to David, which was probably one memorable memory of my life. And I asked him where I should go to see Minge, the best Minge. And he said, you could have to go to the village of Onda or Onta. And I'd already been. So anyway, I've been there many times since. And as an extension, I became very involved with Mashko and actually became very friendly with Shoji Hamada's son, Atsuya. And he and I shared a birthday, and he would come to, when he was in Tokyo for his Mitsukoshi exhibition every October, which always fell on our birthdays. He always came to my birthday party, and we shared that. And we actually have a record of him where he signed and he said, Atsuya Hamada Mashko. it's just anecdotes. I must say, David, I was thrilled with your talk. I love and I think it's about time that Bernard Leach got some of the glory and attention. I don't think too many people know about his input into Japan, that he brought the first printing press and other things. I think Yanagi and Hamada have naturally and rightly so taken the glory. But it's nice to see that Bernard Leach, sorry, is getting more attention now. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, could I just add one
Yes.
comment that did occur to me from the biography in English? I think he was fated. I mean, Leach, when he came to Japan after the war, he was tremendously famous. But there's a moment later in his life, I think it's about the 1960s, or maybe the late 50s, where his wife Janet wanted to come back. She had been in Japan and studied under Hamada, I think. And she wanted to come back, and they were thinking of coming back. And both Hamada and Yanagi write letters. This is in the English biography. Write letters to Leach saying, "Don't."
I do think that there's less knowledge currently. There may have been in the past, but I don't feel that Bernard Leach has got the same.
I know, but what I meant, my reading of that, I mean, it's just curious that because he was quite well known in Japan, but at that moment, he's being pushed by Janet, his wife,
Yes.
to come back, but they say don't. And my reading of that is that if he comes back at that moment, the mystique will be gone.
Oh,
It doesn't say that, but that's my reading of it.
My reading is a bit different.
Okay, anyway, it's just
because I go to Mashko and in the last couple of years, and people don't seem to know Bernard Leach.
No, well, this is the 60s, of course, but anyway.
I'm talking about 2015.
Right, okay, yeah.
16, 17. And I just found it very sad.
Yeah.
Because he really is
there's a museum to Hamada, of course.
Information. And he gave so much.
Yes, indeed. There is a Hamada museum, I think. Hamada Shoji. There's a museum.
Of course there is. Yes, the Hamada.
Right, Leach has been sidelined.
Is it? He has work there. There are works by him in display there, but people don't seem to. You talk to young potters, prominent young potters, and they don't know the contribution that Bernard Leach made. The limited ones I've spoken to, but they are prominent.
I don't know if Nain Woodrow, who I had an email from last night, she probably didn't come. I don't think it would have been convenient, but I don't know if she runs a pottery in London called North Street Pottery. North Street Potters, I think she's not the only one, although she started it in Clapham in London, and it seems to be thriving.
I know the Welsh potters, David and Margaret. I can't think of their name right now.
But she studied in Mashko. No, in Kasama.
A lot of Deshis go to Mashko.
And she was told me in her email last night that she had actually met Hamada because he was he had visitors all the time apparently, but she did
as well, yeah.
actually she did actually have a chance to meet him when she was doing potting there. And also she was asked to interpret for Leach once in England because she could speak Japanese. So he didn't speak that fluently, obviously.
No.
She was asked to do that, but it was just kind of curious. And she has a very thriving pottery, and she comes directly out of all that. And she's teaching other people in London.
Yeah. You go into the Craftsman Potter just off Carnaby Street, and the first time I went there, which I'm not even sure if it's still there, but this would have been about 20 years ago, I thought I'd stepped into Mashko.
Wow.
Because it feels and looks and everything is just so Japanesque, so full of Japanese minge, which was wonderful for me. But
anyway.
the best pottery in Britain is very influenced by the minge potters.
Okay, well, thanks for that.
Thank you.
Great, Mashko. I love that place. Okay, Peter O'Connor, thank you for hands up. please go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a one recollection. About 1976, I was taken to Mashko by a woman called Bin Kwahara, whose husband was a sculptor. Has some sculptures in the in the museum at Hakone. Anyway, so she took me along there, and I went to Hamada's studio. Of course, I knew absolutely nothing about pottery, although my godfather was a potter, Hans Koper. Anyway, I went there, and I was sort of sitting around, and it was a kind of dutiful visit. And Hamada had just taken out, or had put in, I can't remember exactly, a very large plate. I think it's what would be called a charger.
Mhm.
You know, and he'd got some writing on it, and so on and so forth. So I was just a year into Japan at that time. I arrived in 76, left in 78, came back in 95. Anyway, I expressed my polite admiration of this, but there must have been a bit more enthusiasm. I really didn't understand anything about it. And we'd taken the bus from the station to get to his studio, his anyway, I expressed mild admiration for this charger, and he offered it to me. And I looked at the size of it and remembered the bus journey. It was quite hot. I think it was summery. It was quite hot at that time, and so I made polite excuses and declined because I couldn't bear the thought of lugging it all the way back to Tokyo. And of course, later I saw it in the British Museum, and regretted because I was absolutely broke at the time. But that was my experience.
That is a great story.
Wonderful story.
Actually, when I can just add, it's a great story. When I was on sabbatical in 2010 to 11, and I went back to my university, and I rang them up to ask if anybody knew anything about this Guy Wilson, the man whose name I was thinking that about this Hamada vase, I wonder what happened to that. But nobody knew anything about him, or the person who'd been connected it was all gone. I was imagining it would probably be in a garage somewhere full of turpentine with a paintbrush sticking out of it or something. But who knows? Do they know what they've got? I mean, he was a single man himself. He didn't have any descendants. Somebody must have it somewhere, but do they know what it is? I don't know.
It does relate to that principle that came up earlier, where these things were supposed to be utility.
Yeah.
To be used, and of course all of them have ended up, nobody dares touch them, because they're
that's the contradiction. I know.
So that was all really.
But yeah, that's a great story about the charging.
I can add that I would be invited into Mrs. Hamada's home with my students, and we would sit around the irori and we would peel nashi with the students, and she and Atsuya would regale us with tales of Hamada Shoji, and how the generals would come and sleep there, and all the military people, and that they both the Hamadas all fell in love with British bread and Cox's orange pippins apples.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, any other comments or stories to share? We might end a little bit early tonight, which is quite okay. Everyone good? Okay, well, let's thank you once again, David, for putting together.
I have a question.
Wait a minute.
I have
Okay.
a question. What's
Okay.
the relationship? I used to live in Ibaraki, and I knew a Canadian potter in Kasama.
Yeah.
And what's the relationship between Mashko and Kasama? I mean, Kasama Yaki and Mashko Yaki. I'm an ignoramus. I don't even know if the question is good. Can anyone explain that?
They're related.
I can add things that I've heard over the years, and that is that there was a German potter that tried to make it in Mashko, and got a little frustrated. So he went to the next village, which was Kasama, and he set up a kiln. And to be different from Mashko, he did the shio, the salt, and he would at a certain point pull out the pungs and throw in salt, and it would create a chemical reaction. And that's the meibutsu, the main point at some point of Kasama pottery is that it has the salt reaction pots.
Do you know his name?
I used to, but for the life of me, I can't remember. He was a German potter, is what I remember.
I think I may have known him.
Yeah, you may. Yeah.
Okay.
That's what Atsuya told me. I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, anything else? All right, last chance. All right, David, thanks for all your work putting this together.
Thank you. It was really interesting.
Good to see
Yes.
new
Thank you very
faces.
much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
You're a very lucky man.
Let's hear some more from Timothy about pottery, and I need to be enlightened.
Well, I'm no expert. Let me say that.
You know a lot more than I do.
We'll be hearing from him, and from Tim Harris and Rob Barnard are going to talk to us soon. And let's see, Michael Watson in a couple months is going to give us a talk about something he hasn't decided yet. I'll be pestering him about this later. And John Toffelmeyer, who is here most of the time, he's our speaker next month. So we've got things wrapped up into early next year. All right, with that, I'd like to thank everybody very much. I trust we'll be in autumn weather for the next meeting of Informasia. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you very
David.
much.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.